So let's talk about Charles Dickens. Now I like Dickens. I like Dickens a lot. Like, a lot. Here are some Dickens books I own. Here are some more Dickens books I own. Here are some really old Dickens books I own. Here are some even older Dickens books that I own. Here's me looking very excited outside the Charles Dickens Museum in London. Here is my Dickens phone case. Here are my Dickens bracelets. Here is my Dickens t-shirt. Here is the illustration from his novel Dombey and Son that hangs on my bedroom wall. And here is the massive picture of Dickens and all his characters that hangs on my bedroom wall. You might say I'm obsessed. You're probably right. Charles Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 and he died on the 9th of June 1870. During his life he wrote and published 14 novels along with several shorter works. He was also writing his 15th novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, when he died. He's one of Britain's most famous writers alongside Shakespeare and Jane Austen, and he's probably the most famous writer from the Victorian period. And he's great. So great. Now I know that a lot of people don't really like Dickens, and as much as I absolutely love him and he is my favourite author ever, I do understand that he's a bit of an acquired taste. His novels are pretty long, which I think often puts a lot of people off. Several of them are over 1,000 pages. He also has quite a dense and extravagant writing style. He often uses more words than you might think are necessary, but one, it's really cool and distinctive, and two, if you were getting paid by the word, you would do the same. And I know that his plots are melodramatic and ridiculous and sometimes not believable, and I know that his characters are grotesque and weird and often don't seem quite human, and I know that sometimes it can take a good 10 chapters to get into a Dickens book, but he is amazing. I promise. So today I decided I wanted to do a video in defence of Charles Dickens. So here are the 5 reasons why I think Charles Dickens is absolutely amazing and brilliant and just the best. As a side note, today I'm going to just talk generally about all of his works, but at some point in the future I am planning on doing a video where I go through all of his books each in turn, so let me know if you'd be interested in seeing that. Number 1. Plots, subplots and narrative structure. One of my favourite things about Charles Dickens' novels is that he manages to have so many plots going on at the same time. He can have like 10 plots going on in one book and then they all magically and beautifully weave together at the end, which I love. It's for this reason that while I love Great Expectations and David Copperfield, they're not my favourite of his books. Because they're in first person, you sort of only get one plot going on at a time, and the books of his that I really love are the really massive fat ones with tons of plots at once. So Our Mutual Friend, Dombey and Son, The Old Curiosity Shop, Little Dorrit and Bleak House are my favourites. The other great thing about having so many plots is that you can normally find one that you really love, even if you don't love all of them. For example, as I said, The Old Curiosity Shop is one of my favourite Dickens novels, but actually the central plot about little Nell and her grandfather I'm not that interested in. What I really love about The Old Curiosity Shop is the 2 subplots going on in London. So it's great that you can find one bit of the book that you really connect to and then that helps you connect to all the rest of the plots. I think the quantity and interweaving of plots is something that tends to put people off Dickens nowadays. I think it's partly to do with the historical context, because Dickens was writing serially and his books were being published in monthly parts in magazines. They do have a slightly different form to what we're used to, and sometimes I think to people they don't really feel like novels because they have so many plots going on. In a way, the modern equivalent of Dickens books is not really novels, it's TV dramas. However, I really love books that have lots and lots of plots going on at once. I just find it really enjoyable because you get to move between one and the other, and the way they all link together is just beautiful and it's great. Number 2. Characters. I love Dickens's characters. A lot of people say that Dickens uses stereotypes, but I would like to dispute this. None of his characters are stereotypes. They are all exaggerated and melodramatic and really weird, but none of them are stereotypes because they are all incredibly and beautifully unique. I think a lot of people today find Dickens's characters over-exaggerated and odd. I think it's partly to do with Dickens' personal writing style, but also partly to do with the way they were being published. Because, as I said, they were being published serially, characters had to be memorable from one month to the next, or even from 1 month to 6 months later if a character is in the beginning of the plot and then doesn't turn up again till later. So of course they're going to be exaggerated and weird. They need to be memorable for the readers. But I actually really love this about Dickens. I think his characters are brilliant because they're so funny and odd and lovely. Another thing I really love is that even Dickens's minor characters are unique and odd. Even if they seem a bit two-dimensional in their strangeness, they always have something distinctive about them which I like. Something that really annoys me in books is when the central 1 or 2 characters are really interesting and deep and well defined, and then all the rest of the minor characters are just boring boring and have nothing interesting about them, and they're just there to serve plot functions, and you never get that in Dickens. Like, even if you just see a man in a carriage and he's a stranger and you're never going to meet him again, he's still going to be weird and well-defined and have something eccentric about him, which I like. It's just so much fun. In fact, a lot of my favourite Dickens characters are not the main ones, they're the minor ones. I think he does villains very well, especially in his later books. In Tale of Two Cities, Madame Defarge is brilliant, and in Our Mutual Friend, Bradley Headstone is very well done, because he's kind of evil and kind of sympathetic, and you kind of understand why he's doing it, but he's also scary, and it's so good. In terms of other minor characters, I love Jenny Wren in Our Mutual Friend, and I love Dick Swiveller, unfortunately named, in The Old Curiosity Shop. There's just so many little minor characters that are so exciting and different in all of his books. He had such an amazing imagination. Number 3, storytelling. Dickens knows how to tell a story. Now for me, I think you can kind of separate novelists into people who are really good novelists and people who are really good storytellers. So for example, I quite like the author Julian Barnes, but I think he's a much better novelist than he is a storyteller. I like his books, but normally what I find interesting about them is the themes and the stuff they're exploring, not really the characters and the story. Dickens, however, is a brilliant, brilliant storyteller. I absolutely love his narrative voice. As I said, he uses a lot of words, and sometimes people think it's too many. But you know what? It means, because he kind of lets himself ramble in this beautiful way, it means he comes out with the weirdest similes that are just beautiful and lovely. There's this trend in contemporary Western literature at the moment that says show, don't tell. And I understand why. It's so much easier to show in writing and do it well than to tell and do it well. I think as well, with TV and film being so popular nowadays, we're really used to watching stuff unfold rather than being told how it unfolds. And I don't think that's a problem. Sometimes I'm reading books and I think they're telling me too much and I just want them to let it be. But sometimes it's really nice to read an author who's just a really good storyteller. I also think Dickens works really well read aloud. I really like listening to his work on audiobook. It was sort of written to be read aloud. Dickens used to do a lot of dramatic readings himself. He absolutely loved doing that. And I do think you get that sense of an oral tradition in Dickens's works because he's such a good storyteller. They're sort of not just novels, they are more than novels. Number 4, author progression. This might sound like a slightly weird one, but it's actually quite important to me and one of the reasons why I do really love Dickens so much. He wrote 14 books over his lifetime, so that's quite a lot. And his writing changes massively over the course of his books, as do his characters and his plots. I find this incredibly, incredibly interesting. I've read all 14 of his novels and some of his shorter works. I did my undergraduate dissertation in how presentations of gender changes over time from Dickens' early novels to his later novels. In doing that, I looked a lot at just how his books overall change over time, and they do change massively. You can see over the course of his 14 novels, Dickens becoming not only a much better writer, but a much more tolerant, understanding person, and a person who observes the world much better. That sounds harsh to his earlier novels. I do still like his earlier novels, but the majority of my favourite ones are his later ones. Just if we take the presentation of women, for example, in Dickens' early books, all the women do is faint and cry. That's all they do. In the Pickwick Papers, in Nicholas Nickleby, in Oliver Twist, okay, no, Nancy's quite cool, but most of Dickens' early women just faint and cry and do nothing else. And then, by his later novels, that's completely changed, and he has lots of heroines. If you think about Florence Dombey and Amy Dorrit and Lizzie Hexam, and just so many interesting female characters that are so much more than just women who cry and faint. And in Our Mutual Friend, we have quite a lot of working women as well. So Lizzie Hexam starts out working for her father, rowing the boat, and then she goes on to be a seamstress, and then she goes on to work in a paper mill. We also have Jenny Wren, my favourite character, who runs her own doll's dress shop and is brilliant at it and just great. We also have Betsy Higden, who works for herself and no one else, and she refuses to take charity from her wealthy friends no matter how much they offer it. She wants to work for herself, and Dickens describes her as a heroine. And it's just such a massive transformation from his presentation of women in his early books, and it's really nice to kind of watch him develop as a person over his books. We can also see this change in other areas of his work. For example, the presentation of Fagin in Oliver Twist is pretty anti-Semitic. It's not very nice. But then, in Our Mutual Friend, there's this character, Mr. Ryer, who is Jewish and lovely, like inhumanly nice. And you can kind of see that Mr. Ryer is Dickens' apology for Fagin, or you can read it that way, and I would, because it seems nice. Oh, Dickens became a better person, you make me happy. You can also see the same in the way Dickens presents disability. So in quite a lot of his early novels, disabled characters are evil and villains. So if you take Quilp from The Old Curiosity Shop, who is the main villain of that book, and he is a dwarf, and his disability is kind of bound up with his evilness in a grotesque way that is not very nice. And then in Our Mutual Friend, which again, this is why it is my favourite book ever, because it's just the culmination of Dickens' genius and niceness and everything. Anyway, in Our Mutual Friend we have Jenny Wren, again, my favourite character. She's disabled, she can't walk with without a cane, but it doesn't hold her back, and she tries as hard as she can in life, and she does really well for herself, and she's definitely a heroine, and she knows what's right, and she's just this fascinating, brilliant character who is so much more than her disability and is just brilliant, and oh, it's lovely. Number 5, the balance. This is the most important thing for me. This is the real reason why Charles Dickens is my favourite author ever. For me, Dickens has the perfect balance between light and shade, between making me smile and making me cry, and making me think and making me laugh. It's just perfect. I always find this a problem when I'm reading books. Like, I love Jane Austen, she's my second favourite author, I think she's brilliant, but sometimes I just do want a little bit more misery in her books. Equally, I love Thomas Hardy, he's definitely in my top 10, but sometimes they're just too much. I just can't cope with the misery. I don't think I could read 2 Hardy books back to back. Like, I love Jude the Obscure, one of my favourite novels ever, but just, I just can't. Dickens, though, has such a great balance, and for me it is the perfect balance. It is the exact balance that I want in all books. They're really funny, but they're also commenting a lot on social issues, and they're quite deep, and there's also really profound, sad moments. There's death, and there's misery, and there's also laughter, and beauty, and romance, and it's just, everything you could possibly want. And I find no one funnier than Dickens. Like, I find Dickens hilarious. Frequently I have been sat on the train reading Dickens, just giggling to myself, and people just give me weird looks. It's a good life. It's really nice to have light relief amongst sadder, deeper, darker issues. And some of his novels are a lot funnier than others. I think Pickwick Papers has a lot more humour than it has anything else, and Tale of Two Cities doesn't really have much humour for understandable reasons. It's about the French Revolution. It wasn't terribly funny, let's be honest. Hard Times also doesn't have that much humour, and it's a bit more philosophical than some of the other ones. But so many of his books just get this lovely balance, and it makes it such a joy to read because it's never too dark and deep and depressing, and it's never too light and fluffy, and it's just perfect. I think that's everything I wanted to say. I have a feeling this is gonna have been quite a long video, so I'm quite impressed if you got to the end. I'm probably going to leave it a month or 2 before I do another Dickens video, just in case I explode with excitement, but I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you like Dickens, and if you haven't read any Dickens, then please go away and read some, because Dickens is great. It's great. So, thank you for bearing with all my Dickensian ramblings. Happy reading, and I will see you next week.